Well, last week we looked into the account of Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute who protected the spies that Joshua had sent into Jericho. Rahab was not spared simply because she did not reveal their mission, but she was spared because she recognized and confessed that the God of the Israelites was the only true and living God. And Rahab acted on her faith by helping the spies, by tying the scarlet cord in her window, by bringing her family and loved ones into the safety of her home. And she was declaring her allegiance to the God of Israel, and she demonstrated by her obedience. And as you saw last week, Rahab was the key figure in chapter 2, but we can't overlook the spies and what we learned from them. These two men were led to the home of a prostitute. And surely they had a lot of questions. Is it a good idea for us to be seen in her home? Are we going to trust a Canaanite and a prostitute at that to protect us? Are we going to trust her with our lives? Why would God lead us here? Had to be questions in their mind, but because these two men were obedient, they had front row seats to God's plan, to the miracle of salvation in the life of Rahab. They saw the grace of God at work in her. They saw the heart of God to spare her from judgment. They saw that God's mercy is literally available to anyone who is truly repentant. And as we think about the roles of the spies in the story of Rahab, we need to be reminded that God sends his children out. We may not know why he sends us to places or to people to whom he sends us, but if we simply obey and go, we're going to see his hand at work, and we're going to experience the blessing of being a part of his purpose. Just like the spies, we are sent as ambassadors of the kingdom. We are sent to herald the message of the gospel. Now, Rahab's story, I alluded to this very quickly last week as we were wrapping up. Her story doesn't end here in Joshua 2. Remember that Rahab was a Gentile, and she was spared, and she later became part of the nation of Israel. She married into the people of God. You know, even before the Apostle Paul, in the New Testament, we see that the Apostle Paul is given the privilege, the responsibility. He is the emissary to take the gospel to the Gentiles. But even before that, we see that God had a love for and was saving the Gentiles. Listen, without question, the Israelites were and are God's chosen people, but God's plan always included people from every nation, not just Israel. Well, Rahab's story doesn't end here in Joshua. She's mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 1 and verse 5, she is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. If you actually go back and read the genealogy, you'll find out there were 4 women mentioned in that genealogy, but think about the 4 women. One was guilty of incest, one was a prostitute, one was a Moabite, and one was guilty of adultery. God uses imperfect people. And these 4 women, including Rahab, are mentioned in that genealogy. In Hebrews 11:31, I mentioned to you last week, Rahab is listed, chapter 11 in Hebrews is the hall of faith. It is a listing of people of great faith who are mightily used by God. Rahab is listed there. Rahab is also mentioned in James chapter 2 and verse 25, where she is given as an example of someone who demonstrated living, active faith. She didn't just have faith, she didn't just declare her allegiance to the Lord, she demonstrated it. She acted out her faith. 3 things I want you to remember before we move on this morning from last week. Number 1, God's grace is available to anyone. Sometimes we look at certain people or we know people and we think, boy, that person is so far from the grace of God, that could never happen. No, God's grace is available to anyone. And when God's grace is received, it is life-changing. Those who receive the gift of grace, their lives are changed. As Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5, the old is gone, the new has come. They're a new creature. And then thirdly, I want you to remember that God's grace is delivered by obedient servants. Don't mishear me there. I'm not saying that we're the ones who give the grace. I'm saying that we are the ones, when we obey God when he sends us, we're the ones that let people know that grace is available to them. All right, chapter 3 this morning, moving on. Keep your Bibles open. We're going to be walking through the entire chapter together. Let me ask you this morning, can you remember the last time that you waited for something? Maybe as a child it was Christmas, maybe it was a special occasion or a birthday, maybe it was getting your driver's license, your first car, maybe it was a special trip or vacation, maybe it was your wedding date. Can you remember the last time you waited for a big event and it seemed like the day would never come? Then suddenly it's there. The Israelites have been waiting for 500 years. and the day has come. They're about to go in and possess the promised land. They've waited half a millennium for this promise to be fulfilled, and now they're camped beside the Jordan River. The Jordan River is the last obstacle that they need to overcome before they move in and possess the land that God has given them. Now, those camped on the brink of the river, on the brink of the promised land, were not alive when the promise had been given. They'd certainly heard the promise. You know that through years, over the entire 500 years, as the stories were passed down, they'd heard of the promise that was made to Abraham, that God would give him a land, that God would make him a great nation, that God would make him a nation and a people that blessed all the nations of the world. They had heard the story of Abraham and Isaac, his only son, the only one through whom the promise could be fulfilled. And Abraham was called to sacrifice Isaac, and yet God miraculously intervened and kept the promise alive. They had heard of the ensuing enslavement in Egypt, the fact that Jacob and his sons had gone there because God had sent Joseph ahead to prepare and protect this nation. And they had heard that they had arrived as honored guests, but later had been enslaved by Egypt, but that God had miraculously intervened and freed them from slavery. They had heard, and some of them had experienced, because they had been alive this last 40 years, experienced the rebellion and wilderness wandering, how the people turned back when God told them to go in and possess the land, and how they then got into idolatry. They had heard all the story. They knew that their ancestors had never seen the promise come to fruition. And now here they are. I imagine they're pinching themselves. They're asking, is this really happening? You can imagine the level of excitement as they stood there looking across into that promised land. Do you know that we have a promise we're holding on to, much like them? Our promise is that Jesus is coming again. And when he comes, for those who belong to him, he's going to take us to be with him. He's going to take us to a place, a dwelling place that was made just for us. He's going to take us, and from the moment he takes us, from that moment on, we will be in the presence of God for all of eternity. Like the Israelites, we have to hang on to the promise and keep walking by faith, because in the meantime, there's going to be difficulty and challenge and difficult circumstances on the way. Well, we haven't yet seen the promise that we've been given that will be fulfilled in eternity, but we know that faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. And that's what they held on to for those 500 years. The conquest of Canaan is a reminder that God always fulfills his promises. God always fulfills his promises. Why don't you say that with me? God always fulfills his promises. You know, to be anxious about the promises of God is needless and it's foolish. And I frequently tell you, I preach to myself. Right now, I'm really preaching to myself. There are some things I'm anxious about. To be anxious about the promises of God is needless and foolish. I was talking this week on the phone with one of our ladies who was having a conversation at work about anxiety. And this woman in her workplace looked at her and said, if you Christians believe that God orchestrates everything, then why are you so worried? Now, did you hear what she said? If you Christians. This woman was not a believer. What a charge against us as Christians. That we're anxious and that we worry if we really believe that God is sovereign and he orchestrates everything. Listen, if God says something will happen, it will happen. If God says something will happen at a certain time, it'll be at that time, not sooner or later. If God gives an order of events, it will happen in that exact order. Everything God has revealed, everything God tells us about our future will be fulfilled exactly and precisely. And we should never forget that. So the Israelites are here. They're about to go in and possess the land that God has given them. But as we said 2 weeks ago in chapter 1, they have to exercise faith. They have to act on the promise. Jump in with me in verse 3 of Joshua chapter 3. And so Joshua commanded the people, as soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priest, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it, about 2,000 cubits in length. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you should go, for you have not passed this way before. Now, we'll get to it in a few moments, but down in verse 15, we're told that the Jordan River was at flood stage. Here they are at the moment. They're to go in and possess the land. The river's at flood stage. During the dry season, there are many places that you could easily cross the Jordan, but God leads them to the Jordan River across from Jericho at a time when the river is swollen with spring rain, swollen with the snow melt off from Mount Hermon, and the river is a raging torrent. Now understand, it's not just the fighting men who are going in, it's the entire nation. That means the women, the children, the elderly, all their livestock, all their possessions, they're going to cross this river. It's a physical impossibility. Yet that's what God has told them they're going to do. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'd been there camped along those banks and knowing I was going to have to cross, there'd be a lot of fear and trepidation in my heart looking at that. But God didn't put them there to breed fear in them. God had them camped right on the banks of this raging river to build faith in them, to build dependence on Him. He wants to recognize they have no hope. There is no way they can cross this river apart from God, apart from a miracle of God. Now, you remember in the wilderness wanderings that God led His people as a pillar of fire by night or a cloud by day. Now God's presence is symbolized, verse 3, by the ark. It's the ark that is going to lead them. They are going to cross over. They are going to go in and conquer, but Joshua's not sending the Corps of Engineers and bridge builders in first to prepare the way. He's not sending the army to be the first ones to cross into the land. This is not a military maneuver. It's an act of faith. And so he tells them that the priests are going to lead the procession, and they're going to be carrying the ark. Notice in verse 3, the people are not told to follow the priest, they are told to follow the ark. The ark represented the presence of God. They were not to even look to these religious or godly men, they were to look directly to God Himself. And they're told, when you see God or when you see the ark move, you are to move out. That is great advice. When God moves, we should move. We should follow Him. Verse 4, they're told to keep a distance, to stay behind the ark, 2,000 cubits. That's 1,000 yards, 3,000 feet. That's more than half a mile they're to hang back. Now, there's two reasons for that. One, you know, if you've studied the Old Testament before, the ark, because it represented the very presence and holiness of God, it's incredibly sacred. You didn't get close to the ark. You certainly didn't touch the ark because you're not supposed to approach God in a careless way. In 2 Samuel 6, you'll see the story of the ark being moved, David having the ark moved to Jerusalem. It's being moved on an ox cart, a brand new ox cart. And the ox stumbles, and a guy named Uzzah reaches out to steady the ark, and he is instantly killed by God. It's a very sacred thing because it represents the presence of God, and we approach God with profound respect and reverence. But there's another reason. It's stated here in verse 4, by staying back, the ark is visible to everyone. We don't know the exact number. The numbers range anywhere from 600,000 to close to 2 million people are going to go into the promised land. Can you imagine with a crowd that size being able to even see what's toward the front? Well, the ark was to be almost over a half mile in front of them because no matter how far back the people were, they would be able to see. Why is that important? Why am I making an issue of that? Because they were to follow God. Not just follow everyone else, but follow God. Not just follow the person directly in front of them. They were not even told to follow Joshua. They're told to follow God. And so the ark had to be far enough in front that they could see the ark, that every individual person, every man, woman, boy, and girl could see. They could set their eyes on the ark, set their eyes on the presence of God. Verse 4 tells us why, that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. Well, we like our routines and schedules, don't we? We like the comfortable, the familiar. But what are we missing when we're not willing to step out in faith and go new places with God? You've not passed this way before. It was a new journey, a new venture for them. You know, even with our routines and schedules, every day is a new day, isn't it? You may have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen tomorrow. If you go to work or if you go to school, you may have a pretty good idea of how your day is going to flow, but every day is a new day. And so every day we need to, as they were told to do, to closely follow the Lord, to keep our eyes on the Lord and to follow him. Look at verse 5. Part of the preparation to cross the Jordan and enter the land included consecrating themselves. What does it mean to consecrate? It's to set yourself apart, to be different. It would have made perfect sense if Joshua told the entire assembly gathered there, especially the fighting men, hey, make sure your swords are sharp, make sure of the integrity, check the integrity of your shields. But there's no military instruction given, because this is not a military battle, but it is a spiritual battle. And so all of the people are told to prepare themselves spiritually. God was going to reveal himself by performing a miracle in their midst. The very presence of God was going to be on them and with them. They needed to physically wash themselves. They needed to mentally put away any worldly thoughts or concerns, because God was going to be in their midst. Would you stop and think for just a moment? If you had the opportunity to meet someone in our world, someone that you considered really famous or really important, political leader, military leader, just someone that you considered famous or important, and they were coming to your house, would you prepare? What would you wear? What would your house look like? These people were about to see a majestic revelation of God, and Joshua's basically telling them, listen, you need to be prepared for, and you need to believe, and you need to expect to see a miracle when God shows up in our midst. I thought about that this week as I was studying this passage, and I thought, maybe in our day we treat our relationship with God too commonly to expect a miracle. We've lost sight of the fact that we have a God who can do the incredible and do the humanly impossible, so we don't expect it. We don't prepare for it. Look with me in verse 6. Joshua said to the priests, take up the ark of the covenant and pass on before the people. So they took up the ark of the covenant and went before the people. Then the Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And as for you, command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, when you come to the brink of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. So the people have been instructed to follow the ark, and now Joshua's giving specific instructions to the priests as to how they were to lead the crossing. I don't think Joshua was surprised at all about what God was going to do in the crossing of the Red Sea. Of all those who were still alive, of all the men who were still alive as they come again to the brink of the promised land, only Joshua and Caleb had witnessed the miracle of the Red Sea crossing. But you see in verse 7 that because of Joshua's faithfulness, God encourages him once again. He promises Joshua, listen, I'm going to make you as great a leader in the eyes of the people as Moses was. God always blesses and rewards obedience. Always. I thought as I was reading that verse this week, I thought back in 2 Chronicles chapter 16, the story of King Asa. Asa was king of Judah. He'd had success in battle because he had always sought the Lord, and God blessed him. But this point comes in 2 Chronicles 16, where instead of going to the Lord and inquiring of the Lord and trusting in the Lord, he aligns himself with another king. He acted faithlessly. He was disobedient. And 2 Chronicles 16 tells us Hanani, the seer, comes to tell him, hey, the Lord is judging you because you haven't trusted him, because you haven't been faithful. And Asa, from this day forward, your entire reign and all of your life, you're going to be at war. And then in verse 9, Hanani reminds Asa of God's standard for blessing. He says, for the eyes of the Lord reigns throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. Joshua was a man who was fully committed to the Lord. And so the Lord has promised to bless him. In verse 8, Joshua tells the priests to go and stand in the river. I don't know if you've ever tried to stand in a swiftly flowing river, but even in the shallows, you can get knocked off your feet and you can get carried away. But he tells them, you're to go. Remind yourself that they're carrying the ark, You're to go and you're to stand in the river. Now, the miracle we're about to see is similar to the parting of the Red Sea, but let's be careful that we don't put God in a box or assume he always has to act the same way or certain ways. When the people crossed the Red Sea escaping Egypt, God parted the sea before they stepped into it. Now God is telling them they have to first step out in faith before they see the miracle. Now, although these people who were gathered there, other than Joshua and Caleb, were not at the Red Sea, they had heard that miracle retold many times. You can imagine how many times the people in the wilderness wandering over 40 years, how many times they had recounted the miracle of the Dead Sea crossing. And these people who were part of the wilderness wandering, who are alive at this time, had miraculously seen the hand of God provide for them water and food while they were in the wilderness. If there was any fear in the crossing of the Jordan, they only needed to remember. It's important to remember. When challenge comes, when difficulty comes, when our faith is shaken, we have to remember. It's the ability to remember that strengthens us and encourages us to go on with the Lord. Verses 9 through 13, Joshua calls the people near. Maybe it was so they could see the confidence in his eyes and hear the conviction in his voice as he tells them what the Lord has said. Listen, he tells them. God has told you he is giving you this land. He will drive out the inhabitants before you. I wonder if it was the same words that Joshua had used 40 years before when he and Caleb were the only two of the 10 spies who came back saying, no, we can do it. Don't listen to these 10 who are telling you that God won't take care of us. Don't shrink back in fear. No, he told them God has given us the land, and he reminds them God's given us the land. He will drive out the inhabitants before you. And then he says, look, here's how you'll know you can trust him to do that. And he tells them, when the priests carrying the ark, the presence of God, when the priests step into the waters of the Jordan, God will supernaturally cut off the water system upstream. You know that there are a lot of critics of the Bible who like to explain away the miracles, right? Listen to this one. From a geological perspective, the Jordan River Valley lies at the juncture of tectonic plates that create an unstable region. Earthquakes can occur and have been known to block the flow of the river. Can I tell you, God did not need an earthquake to stop the flow of the river? Isaiah chapter 40 verse 12 says, who has held the oceans in his hands? If his hands are big enough to contain the oceans of the entire world, he could certainly hold the waters of the Jordan upstream from Jericho while his people are crossing. But let's just say for the sake of an argument that it was an earthquake. If God were to choose to use an earthquake to stop the rivers of the Jordan, you still can't deny the supernatural. You see, this earthquake occurred on the day and at the exact moment that God told the priests to step into the water. Explain to me how the timing of that would not be a miracle. God didn't need an earthquake. The living God was among them and was with them, and the living God used his hand to stop the waters of the Jordan River. Look now in verse 14. So when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan, with the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and as soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water. And you see the parenthetical phrase here. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks through the time of harvest. Again, it was at flood stage. As soon as those bearing the ark were dipped, the feet were dipped into the brink of the waters coming down from above stood and rose in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, and those flowing down toward the Sea of the Arabah, the Salt Sea, were completely cut off. And the people passed over opposite Jericho. Look at verse 17. Now the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firmly on what? Dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. The river's at flood stage. When the Jordan's at flood stage, crossings that might have been 100 yards over during dry season could be as much as a mile. It's at flood stage. But as soon as their feet touched the waters, the water upstream stopped flowing and stood in a heap at Adam. Adam is not in existence today, but it's estimated that village or that little city was about 15 to 16 miles upstream. Can you imagine the size of the wall of water, all held in place by the hand of God? I don't know, but I imagine the people inside the city of Jericho were looking through the windows in the city wall, and they could probably see that far. And there's this massive wall of water just standing up there, stopped. Look again at verse 17. The priests stood firmly on what? Dry ground. And the people were passing over, all of Israel. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps more than 1 million people, all of Israel passing over on what? Dry ground. Listen, it takes days or weeks without water for a riverbed to become dry ground. Even if it was an earthquake occurring at the exact moment God told them to step into the water, that still doesn't explain dry ground. And the entire nation crossed over as the priest stood holding the ark. The ark was the key. You see the ark mentioned in these 17 verses. The ark is mentioned 14 times. It's the presence of God. God was with them. And as long as they followed him and stayed in his presence, he would protect them and he would fight for them and he would miraculously lead them. And that's true for us today as well. What are the applications that we see here in Joshua chapter 3? Well, the first thing I would see is we need to be careful not to rush off and not to make our own plans. Joshua could have come up with some plan. They could have had a council to come up with some plan. How are we going to get across the Jordan? No, they were seeking God's direction and following him. We always need to seek God's direction and follow him. And then, just as they were told, when God moves, you move. You have to be willing and ready to step out in faith. God may ask you to do something that's far beyond anything you could think or comprehend humanly, but if God tells you this is the plan, this is the direction, this is the path, and you need to step out in faith, follow him. Sometimes he may wait for you to take the step of faith before he acts, just like he did for them. He told them what he was going to do, but until those priests stepped into that raging river, God did not do a thing. The miracle occurred after they stepped out in faith. And can I tell you that steps of faith, no matter how small, prepare you for greater steps of faith? You don't want to come up to a massive step of faith if you haven't been faithfully following God in faith through the years. Otherwise, it will be overwhelming. But as you take a step of faith, any step of faith, it prepares you for the next step, for the greater step, for the greater blessing. I don't even need to say this, but can I remind you that nothing is impossible with God? There's no barrier, nothing that can prevent him from accomplishing his plans and purposes. Nothing in your life is impossible with God. And finally, staying on the bank means you miss a miraculous blessing. Don't stay on the bank. Don't shrink back in fear. Don't disbelieve that God is able to do what he has said he will do. If you stay on the bank in fear, you miss an incredible, miraculous blessing that God wants to perform in your life.